They believed her. Before I even said anything. I didn't realize it straight away, but something felt off the second I walked in. It wasn't obvious. Just small things like conversations stopping slightly, or people acting a bit more careful around me. At first I told myself I was overthinking it, because sometimes the atmosphere just feels different for no real reason. But this didn't feel random, and the more I paid attention, the harder it was to ignore. I sat down, opened my laptop, and started going through my usual work, expecting things to settle. Within a few minutes I noticed something that didn't make sense, and this time it felt more concrete. A meeting I was normally included in had already happened that morning at 9:30. And there was no invite, no message, no mention of it at all. That had never happened before. That meeting had been part of my routine for weeks, so missing it without any explanation didn't feel like a mistake. It felt like a decision that had already been made without me. I checked my emails again, scrolling back through everything from the past day, just in case I'd overlooked something small. There was nothing there. No calendar update or forwarded notes. That's when the feeling changed from confusion to something more specific. It stopped feeling accidental and started feeling intentional. So I asked someone about it, casually, like I was just catching up. I said, "Did anything important come up earlier?" and waited for a normal answer. They paused for a second before answering, just long enough to notice. Then said it was just a quick catch-up, and that I probably didn't need to be there. That wasn't normal, because I always needed to be there. And it wasn't the kind of meeting you just get left out of without a reason. I didn't react straight away, but that answer stayed with me, because it wasn't just what they said, it was how they said it. It felt like they were choosing their words carefully. I tried to carry on with my work, but within the next hour more things didn't add up. At around 10:45 I opened a shared document I'd been leading for weeks. My name was still on it, my sections were still there, but the content had changed, and none of those changes had come from me. I checked the version history to make sure I wasn't missing something. 3 edits had been made that morning by 3 different people, all within a short window. And I hadn't been included in any of it. No tag, no message, no heads up. Nothing that suggested I was still part of the process. That's when it stopped feeling like a coincidence, because now it wasn't just one thing. It was a pattern that was getting harder to ignore. A meeting I wasn't invited to, updates happening without me, people acting differently. All pointing in the same direction without anyone saying it directly. I leaned back and thought about it properly, trying to connect it to something that actually made sense. That's when one moment from a few days earlier came back to me. A conversation that hadn't felt important at the time. We'd been in a team discussion about a project that had gone slightly off track, nothing major. Just something that needed clearing up so everyone was aligned. She had explained what happened, going through the timeline of decisions and where things had slowed down, but something didn't quite line up. Not in a dramatic way, just small details that didn't match what I'd seen myself. So I asked a couple of questions to understand it properly. They were simple questions about timing and approvals, nothing aggressive and nothing personal. Just enough to make sure everything made sense. The whole exchange lasted maybe 2 minutes, and no one reacted strongly. The conversation moved on almost immediately after, and everything felt normal. At least, that's how I remembered it. But clearly, that wasn't how it had been told. Around lunchtime, I asked someone I trusted what was actually going on, and this time I didn't keep it vague. I asked directly if something had been said about me. They hesitated again, then said, "It's just what happened in that meeting." And that was enough for me to know something had changed. I asked what they meant, and this time they told me properly. They said I'd been aggressive, that I'd interrupted her multiple times, and that I'd made things uncomfortable. That it had changed how people saw the situation. I just sat there for a second, going over it in my head, because none of that had happened the way they described. What actually happened was a short exchange where I asked her to clarify something. That didn't match what had already been shared, and that was it. There was no tension, no raised voices, no awkward silence, nothing that stood out as a problem in the moment. So hearing it described like that didn't just feel wrong. It felt like a completely different version of events that had been built from something small. And that's when it really clicked. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. It was a version of the story that had been changed, and then repeated enough times to sound real. And the more I thought about it, the more one detail stood out. She hadn't corrected it, which meant she knew exactly how it was being told. That's when I stopped trying to figure it out mentally, because I already knew what I'd said and how it had actually happened. Instead, I focused on something else. What I could prove. I went back through everything from that day. Emails, messages, notes, anything that could show what actually happened. Not looking for anything specific at first. Just trying to rebuild the timeline properly so I could see it clearly. And the more I looked, the clearer it became that the conversation had been short, structured, and completely normal. With no negative reaction at the time. Then I found something that changed everything. A message she had sent at 10:12 a.m. that same day. Right after the meeting, which I hadn't thought much about at the time. But now it mattered. Because in that message, she described the conversation completely differently. She said it had been helpful, that it clarified a few points, and that it was good to go through it properly. No mention of tension, no mention of discomfort, nothing close to what people were now saying. And that's when everything shifted. Because now it wasn't just my memory. There was proof. Clear, time-stamped, written proof that directly contradicted what was being said. I didn't react straight away or bring it up immediately, because I knew timing mattered. If I brought it up too early, it could be brushed off or explained away. So I waited until the right moment. And it came 2 days later in another meeting, same project, same group of people, same kind of discussion. And just like before, the same version of events started to come up again. Subtly at first, then more directly. That I'd handled things badly, that the situation had been uncomfortable, that changes had been made because of it. That's when I stepped in. Calmly, without interrupting, I waited for a pause, and then said I was confused, because that wasn't how I remembered it. Then I asked one question. I asked why what was being said now didn't match what had been written right after the meeting. The room didn't go silent instantly, but you could feel it shift as people started connecting it. She paused, and this time it was longer, not confusion but hesitation. She tried to explain it, saying things can feel different in the moment, and that maybe she hadn't explained it properly before. But it didn't land, because the message was clear, and it was written. There was no interpretation, no room to reshape it. I didn't argue or push it further. I just let it sit there. And that's what changed everything. Because now people weren't looking at me anymore. They were looking at her. You could actually see the shift happen, the doubt, the realization, the change in how people were processing what they'd been told. The conversation didn't continue for long after that. It didn't need to, because the damage had already been undone. Later that afternoon, I opened the same document again, and this time I'd been added back into everything. No announcement, no explanation, no acknowledgement, just quietly included again like nothing had happened. And that was the final confirmation. Because nothing had been said, but everything had changed. What I didn't expect was for it to come back again. Not in the same way, but enough to make me realize it hadn't fully ended. A couple of days later I got a message from someone I hadn't spoken to much before, asking a simple question about the project. At first it felt normal, but the way they phrased it assumed something, not directly, but enough to notice. It was like they were still working off that same version of events, just toned down slightly. And that's when it hit me. Even though things had been corrected in the moment, the original version hadn't fully disappeared. It had just changed shape. That's the part no one really talks about. Because once something spreads, it doesn't just vanish when it's corrected. It lingers in small assumptions, in how people phrase things, in what they expect without even realizing why. I replied normally, clarified the point, and didn't make it into anything bigger. But it stuck with me, because it meant I wasn't fully past it yet. Later that same day, I was added to another discussion about the same project, this time with a slightly different group. Within a few minutes, I noticed something familiar in the way things were being explained. Not wrong, just slightly off. Like parts of the situation had been simplified in a way that didn't fully reflect what actually happened. And I realized what was happening. The story hadn't just been told once. It had been retold, each time slightly different, each time losing a bit of accuracy, but still sounding believable. And that's what made it harder to deal with. Because now it wasn't just one version, it was multiple versions, all slightly different. All based on the same original shift. That's when I had to make a decision. Not whether I was right, that part was already clear, but how I handled it going forward. Because I couldn't correct every version, and trying to do that would probably make things worse. So instead I focused on something simpler. Consistency. Every time something came up, I responded the same way. Clear, neutral, and specific. No emotion, no over-explaining, just enough to keep things accurate. And over time that started to have an effect. Not immediately, but gradually. Because people started adjusting, not because they were told to, but because they were hearing the same consistent version from me every time. And that started to replace everything else. And that's when it finally started to feel like it was actually over. Not because it had been corrected once, but because it had been corrected enough times to stick. And that's when I understood something I hadn't before. Fixing something like that isn't one moment. It's a process. And if you only fix it once, it doesn't fully go away. You have to outlast it. You have to be more consistent than the version that replaced you. And that's the part that actually changes things. Over the next couple of days, things started going back to normal. People included me again, asked for my input, and brought me into conversations. On the surface, everything looked the same. But it didn't feel the same. Because once you've seen how quickly things can shift without you being involved, it's hard to ignore that. There was one more moment that stayed with me, and it didn't happen straight away. It was a few days later, after everything had already started settling down and things looked normal again. We were in another meeting, similar setup, same people, and at one point the conversation shifted slightly. Someone made a comment about a delay, explaining it in a way that sounded certain, and I noticed how people reacted, because this time no one just accepted it. Someone asked a follow-up question, calmly asking for clarification on one small detail. And that changed the tone of the whole conversation. Because now it wasn't just being accepted, it was being checked. That moment stood out, because a few days earlier that probably wouldn't have happened. And that's when it really clicked for me. It wasn't just that the situation had been corrected. It was that people had seen how easy it was for something small to be misrepresented. And that changed how they listened. Not dramatically, just enough to question things slightly more, and not take everything at face value straight away. That shift was subtle, but it was real. And it made me realize something else. The issue hadn't just been what she said, it was how easily it had been accepted in the first place. Because no one had asked me what actually happened, no one had checked. They'd just believed what they heard first. Not because they were trying to take sides, but because it sounded believable. That's how most of these situations work. Not through something obviously wrong, just something that sounds right enough. And that's what stayed with me. Not just what happened, but how close it came to sticking. Because if I hadn't said anything, that version would have stayed, and over time it would have just become the truth. Be honest, would you have said something straight away, or waited until you had proof like I did? And if you like stories like this, where one small moment can change everything, make sure you stick around for more.